Absurdism. Absurdism is a philosophical perspective that emerges from the confrontation between the human desire for meaning and the apparent indifference or silence of the universe. It is the recognition that while people are inherently driven to seek purpose, coherence, and understanding in their lives and the world around them, the universe offers no clear or definitive answers. This fundamental disconnect creates what is known as the absurd. The term does not imply that life is comically ridiculous, but rather that there is a dissonance between our longing for clarity and the unyielding ambiguity of existence. The roots of absurdism can be traced through existentialist thought, particularly in the work of Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, who both wrestled with questions of meaning in the face of a seemingly godless and chaotic world. However, it was the 20th-century French-Algerian writer and philosopher Albert Camus who most directly articulated absurdism as a distinct philosophical stance. In works such as The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus described the absurd condition as a tension born from the collision of two truths, the human craving for significance and the cold, mute indifference of the universe. For Camus, the absurd is not something that resides outside of us, but arises in the relationship between us and the world. It is not the world that is absurd in itself, nor is it humanity's desire that is inherently flawed, but rather the irreconcilability of the two. This realization can be deeply unsettling, but Camus insists that it need not lead to despair. Instead, it presents a choice. Upon recognizing the absurd, one could choose to escape it, through religion, ideology, or even suicide, but for Camus, these were evasions, forms of philosophical surrender. He argued instead for a third path, to accept the absurd fully and live in conscious rebellion against it. This rebellion is not a call to arms but a stance of defiant joy, a refusal to give in to despair. It involves embracing life in all its complexity and contradiction, without illusion. Camus uses the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to eternally push a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down, as a symbol of the absurd hero. Though Sisyphus's task is futile, Camus imagines him happy, because he has come to understand and embrace his condition. His joy lies in the struggle itself, in the pure act of living with eyes wide open. Absurdism does not deny suffering or the darkness of existence, but it also does not let those become excuses for disengagement. Rather than retreating into despair or clinging to false hopes, it advocates for a life lived with honesty, courage, and even a kind of liberated exuberance. Freed from the need for cosmic justification, the individual can find personal meaning in experiences, relationships, and creative acts, not as eternal truths, but as expressions of freedom and self-assertion. In this way, absurdism stands apart from both nihilism and religious existentialism. It does not claim that life has no value, but that it has no inherent value imposed from without. Meaning, then, becomes something to be created, not discovered. The absurd, far from being a reason to despair, becomes an invitation to live more authentically, with a deeper awareness of the limits and possibilities of human existence. In confronting the absurd, we do not conquer it, but we learn to live alongside it, lucidly, defiantly, and even joyfully. The Trolley Problem. The Trolley Problem is a well-known thought experiment in ethics and moral philosophy that presents a dilemma involving a choice between two harmful outcomes, each with significant moral consequences. At its heart, the problem asks whether it is morally permissible, or even obligatory, to actively cause harm to save more people from a greater harm. Though deceptively simple in its setup, the trolley problem raises deep questions about the nature of moral reasoning, the distinction between doing and allowing harm, and the value we place on individual lives. The most basic version of the scenario goes like this. A runaway trolley is heading down a track toward 5 unsuspecting workers who are tied to the rails and unable to escape. You are standing near a lever that can switch the trolley onto another track. However, there is one person tied to that second track. If you pull the lever, you will save 5 people but cause the death of 1. If you do nothing, the 5 will die, and the 1 person on the side track will live. The central question is, should you pull the lever? This thought experiment is designed to pit 2 major ethical frameworks against each other. A utilitarian approach, which focuses on the consequences of actions, would suggest that you should pull the lever, sacrificing 1 life to save 5 results in the greatest overall good. But a deontological approach, especially one informed by the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, might argue that actively choosing to kill, even for a good outcome, is morally wrong, because it involves using a person as a means to an end rather than treating them as an end in themselves. The dilemma becomes even more complex in variations of the original problem. In one famous version, called the Fat Man or Footbridge scenario, you are on a bridge above the tracks and see a large man standing next to you. The trolley is still heading toward 5 people, but this time the only way to stop it is to push the man off the bridge, blocking the trolley with his body. This version forces the moral agent into a more direct, personal role in causing harm. Many people who are willing to pull the lever in the original version find it much more difficult to justify pushing the man, even though the utilitarian calculus is the same: 1 dies, 5 are saved. This discrepancy in moral intuition has fascinated philosophers and psychologists alike. Why are we more comfortable with impersonal harm, pulling a lever, than with personal harm, pushing someone? Is it because of emotional proximity, cultural conditioning, or a deeper moral principle? The trolley problem exposes the tension between our instinctive moral reactions and the cold logic of consequentialist reasoning. Beyond academic debate, the trolley problem has become relevant in modern real-world discussions, especially in technology and public policy. For example, designers of autonomous vehicles must grapple with scenarios in which a car may need to make a life-and-death decision. Should it swerve to avoid hitting a group of pedestrians if doing so would kill its passenger? These dilemmas are, in essence, real-life trolley problems encoded into algorithms, raising the stakes of philosophical abstraction. The trolley problem has also sparked broader debates about moral responsibility, intention, and agency. Is there a moral difference between killing and letting die? Between foreseeable and intended consequences? What does it mean to bear responsibility for an action when inaction also has consequences? These questions have no universally accepted answers, which is precisely why the trolley problem continues to be a compelling and provocative tool for examining moral theory. Ultimately, the trolley problem does not aim to provide clear-cut solutions. Instead, it forces us to confront the limitations of our ethical principles and the complexity of moral decision-making in extreme situations. It reveals how difficult it is to formulate a consistent moral theory that accounts for both our intuitions and our reasoning, and in doing so, it invites us to think more carefully about the values that guide our judgments in everyday life. The social contract. The social contract is a foundational concept in political philosophy that explores the legitimacy of political authority and the origin of organized society. It refers to an implicit or explicit agreement among individuals to form a society and establish a government that has the authority to create and enforce laws. According to this idea, people consent, either actively or tacitly, to surrender some of their freedoms in exchange for the protection of their remaining rights and the benefits of social cooperation. The theory of the social contract has been developed in various forms by thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and more recently by philosophers like John Rawls, each offering distinct interpretations of what the contract entails and what justifies political authority. At its core, the social contract addresses the question of why individuals, who are naturally free and equal, would choose to live under the constraints of government. It begins with a vision of the state of nature, a hypothetical condition in which there is no government, no formal laws, and no social structure. Hobbes famously described this state as a place of chaos and constant fear, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this condition, Hobbes argued, individuals collectively agreed to establish a sovereign authority, a leviathan, with absolute power to impose order and prevent the return to anarchy. For Hobbes, the social contract justified even authoritarian rule, so long as it secured peace and survival. John Locke, writing later, offered a more optimistic view. He saw the state of nature as a generally peaceful condition governed by natural law and reason, but still unstable due to the lack of a neutral authority to resolve disputes. Locke's version of the social contract emphasized the protection of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. In his view, governments are formed not to impose power over individuals, but to safeguard these inherent rights. Crucially, Locke argued that if a government fails in this duty or becomes tyrannical, the people have the right to withdraw their consent and replace it. This idea would deeply influence liberal democratic thought and played a significant role in the development of constitutional government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered yet another take, focusing on the tension between individual freedom and collective governance. He believed that while people are born free, society often corrupts and constrains them. Rousseau's social contract proposed that true freedom is found not in isolated liberty, but in obeying laws that one has a hand in creating as part of a collective will. This general will represents the common good and the interests of all, rather than the desires of individuals or factions. Rousseau's vision emphasized direct participation and collective sovereignty, which inspired later democratic and even revolutionary movements. In the 20th century, philosopher John Rawls reinterpreted the social contract through the lens of justice and fairness. Rather than describing a historical or hypothetical agreement, Rawls imagined a veil of ignorance, where individuals choose the principles of justice that would govern society without knowing their own position within it, whether rich or poor, strong or weak. From this impartial standpoint, people would choose rules that are fair to all, particularly the least advantaged. Rawls's version reframed the social contract not as a literal agreement, but as a moral framework for evaluating institutions and policies. The social contract remains a powerful idea because it provides a rational foundation for political authority. Governments are not justified by divine right, hereditary power, or brute force, but by the consent of the governed. It also serves as a benchmark for legitimacy. When rulers violate the terms of the contract by abusing power or failing to protect rights, their authority becomes questionable or null. In this way, the concept underlies many modern democratic principles, including the rule of law, separation of powers, and the right of rebellion against tyranny. Yet the idea is not without its criticisms. Some argue that the contract is a fiction. No one alive today has literally agreed to be governed, and consent is often assumed rather than given. Others note that traditional versions of the theory often excluded large segments of society, women, enslaved people, the poor, raising questions about who was really part of the contract. Still, as a philosophical tool, the social contract continues to shape discussions about justice, authority, rights, and citizenship, offering a lens through which to understand the responsibilities we owe to each other and to the societies we build together. The mirror test. The mirror test is a psychological experiment designed to assess an animal's ability to recognize itself in a mirror, which is often taken as an indicator of self-awareness. The concept was first formally introduced by psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. in 1970 as part of research on animal cognition. In its simplest form, the mirror test involves placing a visible mark or spot on an animal in a location it cannot see without a mirror, such as its forehead. The animal is then given access to a mirror. If it uses the mirror to investigate or try to remove the mark from its own body, researchers interpret this behavior as evidence that the animal recognizes the reflection as itself rather than as another creature. The mirror test is significant because it suggests the presence of a kind of self-awareness, an understanding that one exists as an individual separate from the environment and from others. This form of self-recognition is seen as a basic but important level of consciousness, beyond simple reflexive behavior or learned responses. In humans, children typically begin to pass the mirror test between 18 and 24 months of age, which developmental psychologists link to the emergence of a more complex sense of self. Over time, the mirror test has been applied to various species, yielding mixed results. Some animals, including great apes such as chimpanzees, orangutans, and bonobos, have reliably passed the test. Elephants, dolphins, and certain species of magpies have also shown behaviors suggesting self-recognition. On the other hand, many animals, including most dogs and cats, do not pass the test, which raises philosophical and scientific questions about the nature of consciousness in non-human creatures. Philosophers and scientists have debated the interpretation of mirror test results. Some argue that failing the test does not necessarily mean a lack of self-awareness, it may simply reflect differences in how different species perceive the world. For example, some animals rely more heavily on smell or sound rather than vision, making mirrors irrelevant to their experience. Others suggest that passing the test indicates not just self-recognition but also a capacity for more complex mental states, such as empathy or theory of mind, the ability to attribute thoughts and feelings to oneself and others. In a broader philosophical context, the mirror test touches on questions about the nature of consciousness, personal identity, and what it means to be aware of oneself. It highlights the challenge of defining and measuring self-awareness in both humans and non-human animals, a challenge that remains central to discussions in philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and ethics. The mirror test serves as both a practical tool in research and a symbolic marker of the elusive boundary between simple sentient existence and reflective self-consciousness. The paradox of the heap. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Sorites paradox, is a philosophical puzzle that highlights the problem of vague concepts and how small changes can lead to unexpected logical difficulties. The paradox arises when dealing with things that have no clear boundaries or precise definitions. It is typically framed using the example of a heap of sand. Imagine a large pile of sand, which everyone agrees is a heap. If one grain of sand is removed from the heap, common sense tells us it is still a heap. If another grain is removed, again, it remains a heap. But if this process continues, grain by grain, eventually only a single grain of sand will be left. At that point, it is no longer considered a heap. Yet there seems to be no clear moment when the heap stopped being a heap. Since removing just one grain never seems to make the difference, logic leads to a paradox. If a heap minus one grain is still a heap, then even one grain would have to count as a heap, which is clearly not the case. This puzzle reveals a central challenge in philosophy concerning vague predicates, terms like heap, bald, tall, or rich, which do not have fixed, universally agreed upon boundaries. The paradox forces us to confront how language and reasoning deal with gradual changes and borderline cases, especially when precise definitions are impossible or unnatural. Philosophers and logicians have proposed various responses to the paradox of the heap. One approach is to accept that vague terms inherently resist sharp boundaries and try to formalize this with fuzzy logic, where truth values exist on a spectrum rather than being simply true or false. In this view, there isn't a single moment when a heap ceases to be a heap, rather, the status of heap becomes less certain or less true as grains are removed. Another response is known as epistemicism. This theory suggests that there actually is a precise cutoff point where a heap becomes a non-heap, but it is unknowable or impractical to determine. Even if humans cannot observe the exact moment, a strict boundary still exists in principle. The paradox of the heap does not only apply to philosophical discussions about language, it also echoes real-world problems in law, ethics, and everyday decision-making, where clear lines are difficult to draw. For example, defining the exact amount of wealth that makes someone rich or the precise age at which a person becomes an adult involves similar challenges. By exploring this paradox, philosophy sheds light on the complexity of concepts people often take for granted, showing that even simple ideas like a heap can reveal deep logical and linguistic puzzles. Moral realism. Moral realism is a significant and often debated position in metaethics, asserting that moral statements refer to objective facts about the world, facts that are independent of human opinions, emotions, or cultural conventions. According to moral realists, when someone says, "murder is wrong," they are not merely expressing a feeling, issuing a command, or stating a social preference. Instead, they are making a factual claim about a moral reality, one that can be true or false in the same sense that statements like, "water boils at 100 degrees Celsius" or "the Earth orbits the Sun" can be true or false. In this view, moral truths are discoverable, not invented, they are part of the fabric of the universe, or at the very least, deeply grounded in human nature or reason. One of the central commitments of moral realism is that some moral claims are objectively true, not just true for me or true in my culture, but true in a way that transcends individual or societal attitudes. This claim sets moral realism apart from various forms of moral anti-realism, such as moral relativism, subjectivism, and non-cognitivism. Where relativists might say that an action is wrong only relative to a specific culture or individual belief system, moral realists maintain that certain actions, like slavery, genocide, or cruelty, are wrong regardless of whether any society condones them. Moral realism comes in different forms, depending on how one grounds these objective moral truths. Some realists are naturalists, who believe that moral facts can be reduced to or identified with natural facts, such as facts about human flourishing, well-being, or evolutionary psychology. In this view, to say that something is good might mean that it promotes health, cooperation, or survival. Others are non-naturalists, who argue that moral facts are real but not reducible to any empirical or physical properties. This position, famously defended by G. E. Moore, insists that goodness is a simple, indefinable property, like yellow, something we can recognize through moral intuition, but cannot fully explain in terms of natural science. Defenders of moral realism often point out that moral discourse behaves like factual discourse. We argue about what is right or wrong, we accuse others of moral error, and we try to persuade people with reasons, suggesting that we treat moral claims as if they are about something real. Furthermore, moral realists argue that we experience certain moral truths as self-evident or undeniable. For instance, the wrongness of torturing an innocent child for fun strikes many as a clear and objective truth, not merely a personal preference or social convention. However, moral realism faces several serious challenges. One major difficulty is the epistemological question: if moral facts exist independently of us, how do we know them? Unlike scientific facts, which can be observed or measured, moral facts seem abstract and intangible. Some critics argue that belief in objective moral facts is no more rational than belief in ghosts or gods. Another challenge comes from moral disagreement. Across cultures and history, people have held wildly divergent moral beliefs. If there were objective moral truths, critics ask, why hasn't moral inquiry led to convergence the way science has? Instead of agreement, we see persistent conflict over issues like abortion, capital punishment, or animal rights. Additionally, the rise of evolutionary psychology has led some to question whether our moral intuitions are shaped more by biological pressures than by rational insight. If our moral judgments are largely the product of evolutionary adaptation, designed to enhance group survival rather than track objective truths, then our confidence in those judgments as accurate reflections of moral reality is undermined. Despite these objections, moral realism continues to attract support from philosophers who believe that denying objective morality leads to untenable consequences. If morality is not real, then there seems to be no firm basis for condemning practices like genocide or slavery beyond personal distaste or social custom. For many, this is too high a price to pay. Even critics of realism often admit that moral language behaves as if realism were true. Whether this is a useful illusion or a reflection of moral reality remains one of the most important open questions in philosophy. In the end, moral realism represents a powerful and enduring belief that there is a right and a wrong, not just in the eye of the beholder, but out there in the world. Whether grounded in nature, reason, or something more mysterious, the realist insists that morality is not just what we say it is, but something we must discover, respect, and be accountable to. Cogito, ergo sum. Cogito, ergo sum, Latin for, I think, therefore I am, is one of the most famous statements in the history of philosophy. Coined by the French philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century, this proposition represents a foundational moment in modern Western thought. It emerges from Descartes' attempt to establish a firm and indubitable basis for knowledge, one that could withstand even the most radical skepticism. What makes Cogito, ergo sum so enduring and profound is not merely its logical simplicity, but its role in redefining how we understand certainty, consciousness, and existence. Descartes begins his philosophical investigation by doubting everything he possibly can. This method, known as radical or methodological doubt, is meant to strip away all beliefs that could be false. He considers the possibility that his senses deceive him, that he might be dreaming, or even that a malicious demon is deceiving him about the existence of the external world, his body, or even mathematical truths. In this exercise, Descartes pushes skepticism to its absolute limit, attempting to discard every belief that could be doubted. Yet, in the midst of this radical doubt, Descartes arrives at a realization that is immune to deception. The very act of doubting or thinking presupposes a thinking subject. Even if he is being deceived, he must exist in order to be deceived. Thus arises the insight, I think, therefore I am. The act of thinking proves the existence of the thinker. This becomes the first principle of Descartes' philosophy, a self-evident truth that survives the most extreme skepticism. Importantly, cogito, ergo sum is not derived through inference or logical deduction from other premises, it is grasped directly through introspection. It is not that Descartes reasons from thinking to existence as one might from premises to a conclusion, but that the awareness of thought and existence occur simultaneously in the mind. When one thinks, one immediately becomes aware of oneself as a thinking being. This insight shifts the foundation of knowledge from the external world to the internal realm of consciousness. For Descartes, it marks the birth of the modern subject, a self-aware, autonomous, rational mind that serves as the starting point for all further inquiry. From this indubitable core, Descartes attempts to reconstruct knowledge of the world, relying on reason to overcome the uncertainties introduced by sense perception. However, cogito, ergo sum also introduces important philosophical tensions. It suggests a deep divide between mind and body, thought and matter, what came to be known as Cartesian dualism. Descartes famously argued that the mind is a thinking, non-material substance, distinct from the extended, physical body. This dualism has influenced centuries of debate in philosophy, particularly concerning the nature of consciousness, personal identity, and the mind-body problem. Some critics have challenged the Cogito itself, arguing that the notion of an I presupposes too much, that perhaps thinking is occurring, but not necessarily that there is a stable, unified self behind it. Others have questioned whether the statement truly escapes all doubt, or whether it smuggles in assumptions about language, logic, and identity that themselves could be questioned. Nonetheless, even these critiques acknowledge the Cogito's historical and conceptual significance as a turning point in epistemology and metaphysics. What Cogito, Ergo Sum ultimately captures is a moment of profound philosophical clarity, the realization that, amid uncertainty, there is at least one thing that cannot be denied, the existence of the conscious subject, however minimal that existence may be. In this sense, it is both a statement of existence and a declaration of independence, that the self, through its capacity for thought, stands as the starting point of knowledge. It reminds us that before we can know the world, we must first know that we are here, thinking, doubting, and reaching out for truth. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is a central issue in philosophy that explores the relationship between consciousness, the mind, and the physical body, particularly the brain. It raises the fundamental question of how mental states such as thoughts, feelings, and perceptions relate to physical processes in the body. Specifically, it asks whether the mind is something entirely separate from the body or whether it is a product of physical matter. The origins of the mind-body problem can be traced back to ancient philosophical traditions, but it gained its most influential form through the work of the 17th-century philosopher René Descartes. Descartes proposed a view known as dualism, arguing that the mind and body are two fundamentally different substances. The mind is non-physical and concerned with thought and consciousness, while the body is physical and operates according to mechanical laws. Descartes' famous statement, Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, highlights his belief that the mind's existence is certain and independent from the material world. However, dualism leads to a difficult question: if the mind and body are entirely separate, how can they interact? How does an immaterial thought cause a physical action, like raising an arm? This interaction problem is one of the key challenges faced by dualist theories. In response, various alternative theories have been developed. One such alternative is physicalism or materialism, which claims that everything, including mental states, is fundamentally physical. According to this view, consciousness and thoughts are products of physical processes in the brain. Modern neuroscience often operates from this assumption, seeking to explain mental phenomena in terms of brain activity and neural mechanisms. Yet physicalism faces its own difficulties, especially in addressing what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience. Another approach is idealism, which suggests that only minds and mental phenomena truly exist and that the physical world is, in some sense, dependent on consciousness. While this view is less common today, it reflects a historically significant perspective that further complicates the mind-body debate. There are also middle ground theories, such as property dualism, which holds that while there is only one kind of substance, the physical, it has both physical and mental properties. Similarly, Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental feature of all matter, not just complex biological systems. The mind-body problem remains unresolved and continues to be a subject of active discussion in both philosophy and cognitive science. It touches not only on theoretical questions about the nature of reality but also on practical issues in psychology, artificial intelligence, and medicine. By questioning the connection between mind and body, this problem encourages a deeper investigation into what it means to be conscious, to think, and to exist as both a physical and a sentient being. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a classic thought experiment in philosophy that explores the nature of identity, change, and persistence over time. It asks a deceptively simple question: if every part of a ship is gradually replaced, piece by piece, until none of the original materials remain, is it still the same ship? At first glance, the scenario might seem abstract or trivial, but it raises profound questions about what it means for something, or someone, to remain the same despite undergoing change. The story originates in ancient Greek writings, particularly those attributed to Plutarch. Theseus, a legendary hero of Athens, had a ship that was preserved by the Athenians as a kind of historical artifact. Over time, as wooden planks decayed, they were replaced with new ones. Eventually, none of the original components remained. Philosophers were then left to wonder, was this still the ship of Theseus? Or had it become something entirely new? The puzzle becomes even more complex with an added twist introduced by later thinkers. Suppose someone had saved all the original, discarded parts and reassembled them into a ship. Now there are two ships, one made entirely of replacement parts and one made entirely of the original materials. Which one, if either, is the real ship of Theseus? Can both claim to be the same ship, or has the identity been split, or even lost entirely? This thought experiment forces us to examine how we define identity. One approach is to say that identity is tied to continuity of form and function. If the ship continues to serve the same purpose, in the same way, perhaps it remains the same ship despite changes in material. Another view suggests that identity resides in the material components themselves, so once they are replaced, the original ship no longer exists. A third possibility is to argue that identity is not a fixed, essential property, but rather a matter of convention, perception, or narrative continuity. The Ship of Theseus has implications far beyond the question of a ship. It is often used as an analogy for human identity. Our bodies and minds change constantly over time, cells die and regenerate, memories fade and shift, beliefs evolve. Yet we consider ourselves to be the same person we were years ago. How do we justify that sense of continuity? Is it because of an unbroken stream of consciousness, a persistent body, or simply a psychological narrative we construct? Modern discussions have extended this problem into areas like artificial intelligence, personal identity in the age of digital avatars, and even legal debates about the continuity of institutions or corporations. In technology, the question might be framed in terms of whether a computer that has all its hardware components replaced is still the same machine. In law, a corporation that changes ownership, structure, and mission might still be considered legally continuous. Why? Ultimately, the Ship of Theseus is not about finding a definitive answer, but about illuminating the complexity of identity itself. It reveals how difficult it is to pinpoint where change ends and replacement begins, and challenges us to think about identity not as a static property, but as something fluid, contextual, and perhaps even a matter of perspective. The thought experiment endures because it touches on something fundamental: the tension between continuity and transformation, and the deep human desire to know what remains the same in a world of constant change. Akrasia. Akrasia is a concept in philosophy that refers to a state in which a person acts against their better judgment. It is the puzzling phenomenon of knowing the right or best course of action and yet doing otherwise. Someone who experiences akrasia might, for instance, believe they should exercise regularly, fully understand the benefits of doing so, even plan to go to the gym, only to skip it in favor of watching television. The term comes from ancient Greek, meaning lack of command or weakness of will, and it has long intrigued philosophers because it seems to challenge the assumption that humans act according to reason. The issue of akrasia was first systematically explored by Socrates, as presented in Plato's dialogues, particularly the Protagoras. Socrates famously argued that akrasia, properly understood, is impossible. He believed that no one willingly chooses to do wrong or to act contrary to what they perceive as good. If someone acts against their better judgment, it must be because they are mistaken about what is truly best. For Socrates, all wrongdoing is a result of ignorance. If a person truly knew what was best, they would act accordingly. This intellectualist view asserts that knowledge is sufficient for virtuous action. However, this explanation did not fully satisfy later philosophers. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, offered a more nuanced account. He acknowledged that akrasia does occur and distinguished between two types, one arising from impulsive passion and another from a more settled kind of weakness. Aristotle explained that a person can have knowledge in a general sense but fail to apply it in the moment due to emotional or bodily desires overwhelming rational thought. In such cases, the person does not act in full knowledge, they are, in a way, temporarily clouded or distracted from their better judgment. This view allowed room for internal conflict and emphasized the role of habituation and moral character in strengthening the will. Throughout the history of philosophy, akrasia has raised difficult questions about human rationality, self-control, and freedom. It presents a challenge to the idea that human beings are unified agents consistently guided by reason. Instead, it reveals a fractured self, where reason, emotion, and desire may be in tension. Later thinkers, such as the Stoics, tried to eliminate the problem by striving for an ideal of inner harmony, where reason would reign supreme. Others, like Augustine, explored akrasia in terms of sin and spiritual struggle, seeing it as evidence of a divided will and the need for divine grace. In modern philosophy and psychology, akrasia continues to be a rich topic of investigation. It is often examined in light of decision theory, behavioral economics, and theories of self-control. Some contemporary accounts describe it in terms of internal conflict between short-term and long-term preferences, or as a failure in the mechanisms of executive function. For example, one may prioritize immediate pleasure despite holding a long-term goal that contradicts it, not because of ignorance, but due to a failure to regulate impulse or delay gratification. Akrasia is more than a theoretical puzzle, it is a deeply human experience. Nearly everyone can recall moments when they acted in ways they later regretted, fully aware at the time that they were making the wrong choice. It speaks to the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of living in alignment with one's values. It raises important ethical and psychological questions about responsibility. If someone knows what is right but cannot bring themselves to do it, are they still blameworthy? Or are they in need of help, understanding, or moral education? Ultimately, akrasia exposes the fragility of will and the constant struggle to live with integrity. It reminds us that knowing the good is not always enough, and that the path to virtue requires more than knowledge. It demands discipline, self-awareness, and often the slow cultivation of habits that align emotion and desire with reason. It is a humbling concept, but also one that invites compassion, for others and for ourselves. The simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis is a philosophical proposition suggesting that reality as we know it might not be the real or base reality, but rather an artificial simulation, perhaps something like a highly advanced computer program. According to this idea, all of our experiences, the physical laws of the universe, and even our own minds might be part of a complex, digital construct created by an advanced intelligence, such as a post-human civilization. Though this notion might sound like science fiction, it has been taken seriously by a number of contemporary philosophers and scientists, not because it has been proven, but because it raises compelling questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and consciousness. The modern form of the simulation hypothesis was most famously articulated by Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003. He presented a formal argument suggesting that one of three possibilities is likely to be true. 1. Almost all civilizations at our level of technological development go extinct before becoming capable of running realistic simulations of conscious beings. 2. If such civilizations do reach that level, they choose not to run such simulations for ethical or other reasons. 3. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. If future civilizations are capable of creating simulations with conscious entities, and they choose to create many of them, then the number of simulated beings would vastly outnumber the number of real, biological beings. In such a scenario, it becomes statistically more likely that we are among the simulated majority rather than the rare originals. The hypothesis rests on certain assumptions: first, that consciousness can emerge from computation; second, that technology will eventually be powerful enough to simulate entire worlds, down to the behavior of atoms and neurons; and third, that such simulations would be of interest to advanced civilizations, either for research, entertainment, or historical exploration. If all of these assumptions hold, then the argument gains force. It shifts from being a wild speculation to a logical consequence of our technological trajectory. The simulation hypothesis intersects with many long-standing philosophical questions. It echoes Plato's allegory of the cave, in which people are imprisoned in a cave and mistake shadows on the wall for reality, unaware of the true world outside. It also resonates with Descartes' skepticism about the external world, his idea that an evil demon could be deceiving us into believing in a false reality. The simulation hypothesis updates these concerns in the language of digital technology, suggesting that the deception might not be supernatural or metaphorical, but computational. If true, the hypothesis would radically alter our understanding of existence. It raises questions about the nature of consciousness: are simulated minds real minds? It challenges assumptions about the reliability of empirical observation. If the universe is a simulation, then its rules could change at any moment, or be designed for purposes unknown to us. It also introduces unsettling ethical implications. Would our creators have moral responsibilities toward us? Are we being watched, tested, or simply ignored? However, the simulation hypothesis is not without critics. Some argue that it is unfalsifiable, that is, there is no possible observation that could definitively prove or disprove it, making it philosophically or scientifically vacuous. Others question the assumption that consciousness could be simulated at all, arguing that subjective experience might require something non-computational or irreducibly biological. Still others suggest that even if simulations are possible, they might be far less common than Bostrom's model assumes. Despite these objections, the simulation hypothesis continues to provoke serious debate, not because it provides clear answers, but because it forces us to examine the assumptions underlying our perception of reality. Whether or not we are actually living in a simulation, the very possibility compels us to reflect on what counts as real, what we mean by truth, and how much of our world is shaped not by absolute facts, but by the frameworks through which we interpret experience. In the end, the simulation hypothesis is less a claim to be believed or dismissed than a lens through which to examine the strangeness of existence itself. It reminds us that even the most ordinary aspects of life, the solidity of a rock, the flow of time, the sense of self, might not be as stable or self-evident as they seem. It is a modern expression of a timeless philosophical impulse, to question the ground beneath our feet, and to wonder whether reality is truly what it appears to be. Amor Fati. Amor Fati is a Latin phrase that translates to love of fate. It expresses a philosophical attitude of embracing life in its entirety, including its hardships, losses, and limitations, with a spirit not merely of acceptance, but of genuine affirmation. To love fate is to welcome all that happens, not with resignation or bitter endurance, but with a wholehearted yes to existence, just as it is. This idea, though present in various philosophical traditions, is most closely associated with Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw in Amor Fati a vital component of strength, maturity, and personal freedom. Nietzsche introduced Amor Fati as an ideal, a way of living that transcends passive submission to circumstance. For him, it was not enough to simply bear the burdens of life with stoic detachment. He believed that the highest form of life was one that actively said yes to everything it entailed. This includes suffering, pain, failure, and even tragedy, not as things to be endured for the sake of some higher good, but as necessary and even beautiful parts of the whole. Nietzsche wrote of wanting nothing to be different, not in the past, not in the future, not for eternity, and this radical affirmation is the essence of Amor Fati. At the heart of this idea is a rejection of resentment. Nietzsche viewed resentment, ressentiment, the tendency to wish that the world had been otherwise, to brood over wrongs or misfortunes, as one of the most corrosive forces in life. In contrast, Amor Fati involves letting go of that wishful thinking and standing firmly in reality, in the present moment, with a deep sense of gratitude for the sheer fact of being. It's a call to live beyond hope and regret, and to find in every event, no matter how painful, a kind of necessity and even meaning. This concept challenges many conventional beliefs about happiness, morality, and human flourishing. Where many philosophies or religions offer hope for a better future or an afterlife, Amor Fati strips away such promises and asks whether one can say yes to life as it is, without appeal to another world. It asks whether one can see beauty even in the struggle, and whether joy can be found not despite suffering, but in its very presence. Nietzsche's idea is closely linked with his notion of eternal recurrence, the thought experiment in which one imagines living the exact same life over and over, down to the smallest detail. If the prospect of such recurrence fills you with horror, then perhaps you are not truly affirming your life. But if you can say, yes, would live it again and again, then you have reached a kind of existential affirmation that Nietzsche believed was the mark of a truly free and noble spirit. Unlike fatalism, which is the belief that everything is determined and thus not worth resisting, Amor Fati is active and creative. It does not ask us to give up effort or ambition, but to engage with life in a way that is not dependent on outcomes or success. It means embracing the process, the path, even the missteps, and allowing every experience, pleasant or painful, to be seen as necessary for one's growth, understanding, or transformation. In this way, Amor Fati is not simply a metaphysical claim, but a moral and psychological stance. It encourages resilience without bitterness, action without complaint, and reflection without regret. It is a powerful antidote to the modern tendency to frame life in terms of dissatisfaction, grievance, or what might have been. It demands a radical honesty, and yet also a deep love for life, in all its imperfection. To live with Amor Fati is to say, this too is part of it, to whatever life brings. It is to find, within the brief and often difficult span of existence, a sense of completeness, not because life is perfect, but because it is ours. And in that embrace, even suffering can become a source of strength, even failure a form of wisdom, and even fate something not merely to endure, but to love. Compatibilism. Compatibilism is a philosophical position that seeks to reconcile two seemingly opposing ideas, that human beings can have free will and be morally responsible for their actions, even in a universe governed by causal determinism. It challenges the notion that determinism, the idea that every event is caused by preceding events according to fixed laws, necessarily rules out freedom. Instead, compatibilists argue that free will is not about being free from causation, but about acting in accordance with one's own motivations, desires, and reasoning, without external coercion. At the heart of the compatibilist view is a redefinition of what it means to act freely. Where incompatibilists, those who believe free will and determinism cannot coexist, tend to define free will as the ability to have acted otherwise in an absolute sense, compatibilists take a more nuanced approach. They argue that freedom does not require metaphysical randomness or the capacity to transcend causality, but rather the ability to act in line with one's internal states, such as beliefs, character, and preferences. If a person acts voluntarily and is not being manipulated or forced, then, according to compatibilism, they are acting freely, even if their choices are ultimately determined by prior causes. This perspective has deep roots in philosophical history. Thinkers like David Hume and later John Stuart Mill defended forms of compatibilism, suggesting that freedom should be understood as freedom from external constraint, not from causation itself. Hume famously argued that just as we consider a river to flow freely when it follows its course unimpeded, so too can human actions be considered free when they proceed from the internal flow of motives and desires. Thus, determinism does not negate freedom, it simply describes the conditions under which choices arise. Compatibilism has important implications for moral responsibility. If our actions are entirely determined, some argue, how can we be held accountable for them? Compatibilists respond that moral responsibility depends not on metaphysical freedom, but on whether an individual's actions reflect who they are. A person can be held responsible if their actions stem from their own reasoning and intentions, even if those intentions were shaped by earlier causes. We do not excuse wrongdoing merely because someone was influenced by past events, rather, we excuse it when their control over the action is impaired, by coercion, ignorance, or mental illness. Critics of compatibilism often claim that it is a semantic trick, a way of redefining free will to fit a deterministic worldview. They argue that this defanged version of freedom lacks the intuitive power that underlies our sense of moral agency, that gut feeling that we could have done otherwise in any given situation. Some incompatibilists, especially those who advocate libertarian free will, maintain that real freedom requires indeterminism, a kind of metaphysical openness or ability to choose between genuinely available alternatives, undetermined by prior states of the world. Yet compatibilists respond that such a notion of uncaused choice is not only mysterious but arguably incoherent. If our choices are not determined by who we are, our character, values, and reasoning, then they risk being arbitrary or unintelligible. In this light, compatibilism provides a more psychologically grounded account of freedom. It locates agency not outside the chain of causes, but within the human capacity for reflection, deliberation, and self-control. In modern philosophy and cognitive science, compatibilism remains influential. Many thinkers consider it the most practical and intellectually coherent way to preserve moral responsibility and personal identity in a world increasingly understood through scientific and deterministic frameworks. Rather than denying causality, compatibilism offers a way to understand human freedom as the expression of an internally guided, rational self, one that may be shaped by the past, but is nonetheless accountable for its present choices. Ultimately, compatibilism invites us to rethink freedom not as a mysterious metaphysical escape from cause and effect, but as something grounded in autonomy, rationality, and integrity. It suggests that even in a determined world, we are not puppets or victims of fate, but active agents capable of shaping our lives through reasoned choice. Eternal return. The idea of eternal return, also known as eternal recurrence, is a profound and unsettling concept that suggests that all events in the universe, every moment, every experience, every action, will recur infinitely, in exactly the same way, over and over again for eternity. Most famously associated with Friedrich Nietzsche, the eternal return is not merely a cosmological speculation, but a deeply existential and ethical thought experiment designed to confront the individual with the weight and meaning of their life. Nietzsche introduces the idea most vividly in The Gay Science and later in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He asks the reader to imagine that a demon were to approach them in a moment of solitude and whisper, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh must return to you." The question Nietzsche presses is not whether the eternal return is literally true, but whether one could affirm it, whether one could embrace their life so fully that they would be willing to live it again and again, forever, exactly as it is. In this sense, the eternal return functions as an existential test. It challenges the individual to examine their values, their actions, and their relationship to life itself. If the thought of reliving your life eternally fills you with dread or despair, then perhaps you are not living in a way that aligns with your deepest self. But if you can say yes to it, not in passive acceptance, but in joyous affirmation, then you have reached a kind of spiritual maturity that Nietzsche saw as the hallmark of the Overman, Übermensch, a figure who has transcended nihilism and created meaning from within. Philosophically, the eternal return raises questions about time, identity, and responsibility. If everything must repeat exactly as it has before, then the significance of each moment becomes infinite. Every decision gains weight, not as a step toward a distant future, but as an eternal echo. There is no escaping into a future where things will be different, there is only the eternal now, returning forever. In this view, life is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. Nietzsche's idea also implicitly critiques certain religious and metaphysical outlooks. Traditional doctrines of salvation, reincarnation, or progress often promise escape, either from this world or from the cycle of suffering. Eternal return offers no such promise. It eliminates transcendence and confronts us with radical immanence: this life, this world, this body, and no other. It strips away illusions of ultimate meaning or divine justice and leaves only the question, can you will this life, with all its imperfection, eternally? While Nietzsche never claimed that eternal return is a scientifically demonstrable fact, he hinted at its possible grounding in physics. If the universe is finite in matter and energy, and time is infinite, then perhaps every configuration of the universe must eventually repeat. But even if this is not cosmologically true, Nietzsche believed it had tremendous philosophical power as a thought experiment. It is not about prediction, but about transformation, about how one lives now, knowing that every moment might return forever. There is both a terrifying and liberating potential in the eternal return. It denies the comfort of final endings or fresh beginnings and instead demands an unflinching affirmation of one's life, as it is. It calls for a love of fate, Amor Fati, the ability to not only accept what happens, but to embrace it with gratitude and joy, as something one would choose again and again. In this way, eternal return becomes an ethical lens, a challenge to live deliberately, creatively, and fully. Ultimately, the eternal return is not just a metaphysical idea or a poetic metaphor, it is a mirror. It asks each person, if your life were to be repeated endlessly, would you live it differently? And if so, why aren't you living it that way now? Existence precedes essence. Existence precedes essence is a central tenet of existentialist philosophy, most famously articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre. In this brief but powerful phrase, Sartre encapsulates a radical rethinking of what it means to be human. Traditionally, in both religious and philosophical systems, it was believed that there is an essence, a fundamental nature or purpose, that defines what a human being is. According to these views, whether defined by God, nature, or reason, the human being has a predefined blueprint or meaning, and life's task is to realize or fulfill that essence. Sartre's reversal of this order, asserting that existence comes before essence, marks a profound shift in perspective. What Sartre means is that, for human beings, there is no given nature or fixed purpose prior to our living experience. We simply are, we exist, and only afterward do we define ourselves through our choices, actions, and commitments. There is no divine plan, no cosmic script, no intrinsic meaning baked into our being. Unlike a knife, for example, which is designed with a specific function in mind, cutting, a human being is not made according to a specification. We are not born with built-in meanings or roles, rather, we are thrown into the world, and it is up to each of us to create our essence through how we live. This idea is deeply tied to Sartre's atheism. Without a creator to assign us a purpose, there is no external source of moral law or identity. We are, in a sense, abandoned to freedom. This freedom is not the light, celebratory kind often imagined in popular culture. For Sartre, it is a heavy, even burdensome freedom, a radical responsibility. Because we are responsible for creating ourselves, we cannot blame our nature, our past, or external authorities for what we become. We are not what we are born to be, we are what we make of ourselves. And this, in Sartre's view, is both our greatest dignity and our greatest anxiety. With this freedom comes what Sartre calls anguish, a deep awareness of the weight of our choices. We are free not only to choose our own path but, in doing so, we also affirm a vision of what it means to be human. Our actions are not isolated, they carry universalizing implications. Choosing honestly, with full awareness of our freedom, is never trivial. It becomes an ethical act, because in choosing, we are saying, implicitly, this is how a human life should be. Existence precedes essence also leads Sartre to reject deterministic views of human behavior. While he acknowledges that our circumstances, social, historical, psychological, shape us, he insists that they do not define us. Even in constrained conditions, we are still free to interpret, resist, or transform our situations. This does not mean that all choices are easy or that all people have equal power, but that no one is ever entirely without agency. We are always, in some way, choosing who we are. The implications of this idea ripple outward into questions of identity, authenticity, and ethics. If there is no fixed essence, then identity is not something discovered, but something forged. To live authentically, for Sartre, is to recognize one's freedom and to live in accordance with it, not to hide behind excuses or play roles imposed by society, but to take full responsibility for one's life. Inauthenticity, by contrast, occurs when one denies this freedom, when one pretends to be an object rather than a subject, when one says, I had no choice, or, that's just who I am. Existence precedes essence is a phrase that resists comfort. It offers no predetermined meaning, no guaranteed fulfillment, and no metaphysical safety net. But in stripping away these illusions, it opens the possibility of genuine human creativity and self-determination. It places the power, and the burden, of meaning squarely in the hands of the individual. We are not here to discover what we are here to decide it. And in that decision, moment by moment, choice by choice, we become ourselves. Negative utilitarianism. Negative utilitarianism is a variant of the classical utilitarian ethical framework that shifts the moral focus from maximizing happiness to minimizing suffering. While traditional utilitarianism, as articulated by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, seeks to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Negative utilitarianism inverts this emphasis, asserting that the primary, or even sole, moral imperative is to reduce or prevent suffering. According to this view, the alleviation of pain, misery, and harm holds greater ethical weight than the promotion of pleasure or well-being. The intuitive appeal of negative utilitarianism lies in the immediate and pressing nature of suffering. Pain is not only more urgent in human experience, but arguably more morally significant. A single moment of intense agony often seems to demand attention and remedy more urgently than a moderate increase in happiness elsewhere. For negative utilitarians, moral action is justified primarily when it relieves or prevents suffering. This focus offers a stark, compassionate lens through which to view ethical dilemmas, prioritizing those in the most distress and demanding that the reduction of suffering be our primary concern. Philosophers like Karl Popper, who flirted with this view, argued that the promotion of happiness is too vague and difficult to define as a political or ethical aim, whereas the avoidance of suffering is more clear-cut and morally imperative. Popper suggested that while maximizing happiness might lead to controversial or coercive outcomes, like forcing people to be happy according to someone else's standards, preventing suffering is a more universally compelling and measurable moral goal. Negative utilitarianism also provides a powerful ethical response to large-scale issues such as poverty, disease, war, and animal suffering. It directs attention to the worst-off individuals, those experiencing intense or prolonged pain, and insists that moral resources should first and foremost be deployed to reduce this burden. This principle aligns closely with humanitarian aid, medical ethics, and social justice initiatives, all of which prioritize relieving suffering over enhancing well-being. However, negative utilitarianism also faces serious philosophical challenges. One of the most controversial implications is that, taken to its extreme, it could justify morally troubling actions. For example, if the elimination of suffering is the highest moral good, some argue that it might be better to end sentient life entirely, since no life means no suffering. This leads to the so-called world destruction objection, the idea that, in theory, the most effective way to eliminate suffering might be to eliminate all beings capable of experiencing it. Most proponents of negative utilitarianism do not accept this conclusion, but its logical possibility poses a deep challenge to the theory's foundations. To address such concerns, some thinkers have proposed more moderate versions of negative utilitarianism. These include threshold models, where reducing suffering takes priority until a certain baseline is reached, or versions that weigh suffering more heavily than happiness without ignoring positive states altogether. These more refined approaches attempt to preserve the core moral insight of negative utilitarianism, that suffering is especially morally urgent, without endorsing extreme or nihilistic outcomes. Despite its difficulties, negative utilitarianism remains an influential and provocative ethical position. It calls attention to the moral gravity of suffering in a way that many other ethical theories do not. By centering the worst experiences rather than the best, it invites a deeper compassion and a more urgent response to injustice, illness, oppression, and cruelty. In doing so, it challenges us to reevaluate what we consider morally important, not by asking how good life can be, but how bad it should never become. Nihilism. Nihilism is a philosophical perspective grounded in the belief that life lacks inherent meaning, purpose, or intrinsic value. At its core, nihilism suggests that structures often seen as sources of meaning, such as morality, religion, or objective truth, are human constructs without ultimate foundation. The term itself is derived from the Latin word nihil, meaning nothing, reflecting the position that there is an absence where people often presume there is presence, absence of objective values, universal truths, or cosmic significance. Philosophers have explored nihilism in varied forms. One of the most widely discussed is moral nihilism, which argues that there are no objective moral truths and that ethical principles are neither true nor false in any absolute sense. This challenges traditional ethical systems by rejecting the idea that there are universally binding rules governing right and wrong. Similarly, existential nihilism holds that life itself, when considered on a grand scale, has no purpose. This viewpoint resonates with the human experience of confronting an indifferent universe, one that continues its course regardless of human concerns, hopes, or sufferings. Historically, nihilism is often associated with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously declared the death of God. Nietzsche did not promote nihilism as an end in itself, rather, he saw it as a cultural condition that arises when traditional sources of meaning, like religion or absolute moral codes, lose their power. For Nietzsche, recognizing this void was both dangerous and liberating. Dangerous, because unchecked nihilism could lead to despair, apathy, or destructive behavior; liberating, because it opened the possibility for individuals to create their own values and meaning through acts of will and creativity. Political nihilism also emerged in 19th-century Russia, where the term gained notoriety through revolutionary movements that rejected existing political and social orders. Here, nihilism became associated with radical skepticism toward authority, tradition, and institutions, often tied to calls for their complete dismantling. Critics of nihilism argue that it risks fostering cynicism and social disengagement. Without shared values or commitments, some fear, human life could dissolve into chaos or alienation. Yet others see nihilism not as an endpoint but as a starting point, a philosophical clearing where, once outdated or false structures are removed, authentic personal or collective meaning can be constructed from scratch. In this sense, nihilism is as much a mirror reflecting human uncertainty as it is a challenge inviting renewed self-invention. Panpsychism. Panpsychism is a philosophical view proposing that consciousness, experience, or some form of mentality is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. Rather than treating consciousness as a rare or uniquely human phenomenon, panpsychism suggests that all matter possesses some form of mental aspect, however basic or primitive. This does not mean that stones, atoms, or tables think or feel in human-like ways, but rather that even the smallest units of reality, perhaps subatomic particles, contain rudimentary elements of experience or awareness. This idea arises partly in response to what is known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers to describe the difficulty of explaining how subjective experience arises from physical processes in the brain. Standard materialist views, which hold that consciousness emerges purely from complex arrangements of matter, struggle to bridge the gap between objective physical facts and subjective mental experiences. Panpsychism addresses this problem by suggesting that consciousness is not something that suddenly appears at higher levels of complexity but is already present, in some form, at the most basic level of reality. Historically, panpsychist ideas can be traced back to ancient philosophies, such as those of the pre-Socratic thinkers and certain interpretations of Stoicism and Eastern philosophies. In the modern era, philosophers like Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz entertained related notions, with Leibniz's concept of monads as indivisible units of reality that each possess their own form of perception or awareness. Contemporary versions of panpsychism come in several forms. One of the most discussed is constitutive panpsychism, which posits that complex conscious experiences, such as those in humans or animals, are constituted from the simpler forms of consciousness found in their basic physical parts. Another is cosmopsychism, which suggests that the universe as a whole possesses a form of consciousness, and what we experience individually are fragments or aspects of this larger mind. Critics of panpsychism often point to its apparent strangeness and the difficulty of testing it empirically. They question what it could even mean for a particle to experience something, or how these hypothetical micro-experiences combine into unified conscious experiences. This is known as the combination problem in panpsychist philosophy, explaining how countless tiny experiences might form the unified, rich consciousness familiar to human beings. Despite these challenges, panpsychism has attracted renewed interest, particularly among philosophers and scientists dissatisfied with both purely physicalist accounts of consciousness and with dualistic theories that separate mind and matter. Its appeal lies in its simplicity and radical inclusivity. By assuming consciousness is fundamental and widespread, panpsychism avoids the problem of explaining its sudden appearance in evolution or human development. Whether or not it ultimately offers a satisfying solution, panpsychism invites a rethinking of the relationship between mind and matter, suggesting that experience may be woven into the very fabric of the universe itself. Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Plato's Allegory of the Cave is a symbolic narrative that illustrates his views on human perception, knowledge, and enlightenment. It appears in Book 7 of his work The Republic and serves as both a metaphor for the philosopher's journey toward truth and a commentary on the condition of ordinary human existence. In the allegory, Plato asks us to imagine a group of people who have been imprisoned in a dark cave since birth. These prisoners are chained in such a way that they can only face the wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, other people pass by carrying various objects. These objects cast shadows on the wall, and because the prisoners have never seen the outside world or the objects themselves, they believe the shadows to be the only real things. For them, the shadows are reality. One day, one prisoner is freed. At first, he is confused and disoriented. When he turns around and sees the fire and the objects casting the shadows, he realizes that his previous understanding was flawed. The shadows were merely reflections of a deeper reality. But the journey does not end there. The freed prisoner is eventually led out of the cave into the sunlight. This process is painful and blinding at first because his eyes have adjusted only to the dim light of the cave. Gradually, however, he comes to see and understand the outside world, recognizing it as far more real and vivid than anything he experienced before. For Plato, this journey symbolizes the philosopher's ascent from ignorance to knowledge. The cave represents the world of appearances and sensory experience, what Plato calls the world of becoming. The shadows on the wall stand for illusions or false beliefs, sustained by cultural conditioning and limited perspective. The world outside the cave symbolizes the world of forms or ideas, which for Plato is the realm of true knowledge. Forms are perfect, unchanging concepts or essences, such as beauty, justice, or goodness, that exist beyond the physical world. When the freed prisoner returns to the cave to share his newfound understanding, he faces skepticism and hostility from those still chained. They cannot comprehend or accept the idea that their shadow reality is an illusion. In fact, they might even resist and attack anyone who tries to free them. Through this, Plato expresses his view that philosophical insight is not always welcomed by the broader society, which may prefer familiar illusions over unsettling truths. The allegory speaks to themes of education, enlightenment, and the challenges of intellectual growth. It suggests that true knowledge requires effort, struggle, and a willingness to question familiar assumptions. Plato's broader philosophical system holds that only through rational thought and philosophical inquiry can individuals move beyond mere appearances and grasp the deeper truths that structure reality. In this sense, the allegory of the cave remains a timeless reflection on human nature, learning, and the often difficult path toward wisdom. Solipsism. Solipsism is a philosophical viewpoint that posits the self as the only certain or knowable reality. At its most fundamental level, solipsism holds that one's own mind is the only thing that can be definitively confirmed to exist. All other entities, other people, the external world, objects, and even time, are perceived as mere constructs or experiences within the individual's consciousness, lacking independent existence outside of that perception. This idea arises from deep skepticism about the possibility of knowing anything beyond one's immediate subjective experience. Since all information about the world comes through the senses or is filtered through thought, solipsism questions whether there is any reliable method for verifying that those perceptions correspond to an external reality. For example, seeing a tree or hearing a voice only guarantees that these experiences occur in one's mind. It does not guarantee the existence of an actual tree or another person speaking. Solipsism takes several forms. Methodological solipsism is sometimes used in philosophy or psychology as a starting point for inquiry, suggesting that understanding begins from the standpoint of the self. This version does not necessarily deny the existence of an external world but temporarily sets it aside for the sake of analysis. By contrast, metaphysical solipsism asserts outright that nothing outside one's own mind exists, viewing the external world and other consciousnesses as illusions or projections. Philosophers such as René Descartes touched on solipsistic themes when employing radical doubt as a method. In his famous Cogito, Ergo Sum, I think, therefore I am, Descartes concluded that while he could doubt the existence of the physical world or even his own body, he could not doubt the existence of his own consciousness doing the doubting. However, Descartes ultimately sought to move beyond solipsism by arguing for the existence of God and an external world. Solipsism, in contrast, stops at the self, refusing or unable to make that next step. Critics often view solipsism as both logically closed and existentially troubling. While it might be irrefutable on a strictly philosophical basis, it leads to a lonely and isolated view of reality. It also faces a practical contradiction. Those who articulate solipsism are communicating with others, implying a belief in other minds even while denying them philosophically. Some argue that solipsism collapses into a form of intellectual dead end, offering no productive way to engage with the world or others, even if it cannot be conclusively disproven. Despite its unsettling implications, solipsism serves as a valuable philosophical challenge. It forces reflection on the limits of certainty, the nature of consciousness, and the foundational assumptions behind everyday experience. While few philosophers embrace solipsism as a complete worldview, many acknowledge its role in clarifying where subjective experience ends and shared reality begins. Tabula Rasa. Tabula rasa is a philosophical concept that suggests the human mind begins as a blank slate, without built-in content or innate ideas, and that all knowledge, beliefs, and character traits are acquired through experience and sensory perception. The term comes from Latin, meaning scraped tablet, or clean slate, and it reflects the idea that at birth, individuals have no pre-existing mental content. This concept stands in contrast to theories of innate knowledge, which hold that certain ideas or principles are present in the mind from the outset. The idea of tabula rasa is most closely associated with the English philosopher John Locke, who articulated it in his work An Essay Concerning Human Understanding in the 17th century. Locke argued against the prevailing notion, influenced by thinkers like René Descartes, that certain moral or logical principles are hardwired into human reason. Instead, Locke claimed that all ideas arise from experience, which he divided into two types: sensation, meaning the information we gather from the external world through our senses, and reflection, which refers to the internal processes of thinking, reasoning, and understanding. According to Locke's view, as individuals grow and interact with the world, their minds are gradually filled with impressions, memories, and ideas derived from these sensory and reflective experiences. Over time, complex concepts and knowledge systems are built up from these simpler foundations. In this sense, Tabula Rasa is not only a theory about learning but also about the formation of personality, moral understanding, and intellectual development. The implications of Tabula Rasa extend into debates about education, psychology, and even politics. It supports the idea that environment and upbringing play a decisive role in shaping an individual's character and abilities. Philosophers and social reformers influenced by this view have often argued that inequality and injustice are not the result of natural differences but of differing experiences and social conditions. For example, if all people begin with the same blank slate, then differences in knowledge or virtue must be attributed to differences in education, opportunity, or cultural influence rather than inborn traits. Critics of Tabula Rasa point to evidence suggesting that some cognitive structures may indeed be innate. Modern psychology and neuroscience have identified certain reflexes, preferences, and learning capacities present from birth. For instance, newborns display an ability to recognize faces or respond to language patterns before significant learning has occurred, which suggests some mental architecture exists prior to experience. Despite such critiques, the idea of Tabula Rasa remains influential as a foundation for theories of empiricism and human development. It underscores the importance of experience and learning in shaping who we become, reinforcing the belief that much of human nature is molded rather than predetermined. Whether taken as a literal truth or as a guiding principle, Tabula Rasa continues to frame how thinkers consider the relationship between individuals and their environment. The Gettier Problem. The Gettier Problem is a philosophical challenge to the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief. For much of Western philosophy, it was widely accepted that a person knows something if three conditions are met: the belief is true, the person believes it, and there is good justification for that belief. In 1963, philosopher Edmund Gettier published a short paper that offered simple cases showing that these three conditions might all be present, yet what we would intuitively call genuine knowledge is still absent. In Gettier's examples, a person arrives at a true belief through reasoning or evidence that is, by accident or hidden error, unreliable. One well-known case goes like this. Imagine someone named Smith has strong evidence to believe that Jones owns a Ford. Perhaps Jones has always owned a Ford and was just seen driving one. Based on this, Smith forms the belief, either Jones owns a Ford, or Brown is in Barcelona, even though Smith has no idea where Brown is. By coincidence, Jones does not actually own a Ford, he recently sold it, but Brown, as a matter of fact, happens to be in Barcelona. Smith's belief is true, justified by his evidence about Jones, yet we hesitate to say that Smith knows the truth, because part of his reasoning was based on a falsehood. These kinds of cases, now called Gettier cases, reveal that justified true belief might not be sufficient for knowledge. They show that knowledge requires something more, some condition that blocks the possibility of accidentally true beliefs being counted as knowledge. Philosophers have proposed various solutions to this problem, such as adding a fourth condition like a no false lemmas clause, meaning knowledge cannot be based on any false steps in reasoning, or focusing on reliability theories that emphasize the dependable origin of beliefs rather than just justification. The Gettier problem has had a lasting impact on epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. It reopened debates that many thought had been settled and forced philosophers to re-examine what it really means to know something. Although many theories have been proposed in response, there is still no single definition of knowledge that avoids all possible Gettier-like cases, keeping the problem both alive and relevant in philosophical discussion. The paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance is a concept in political philosophy and ethics that explores the limits of a tolerant society. Originally articulated by philosopher Karl Popper in his 1945 work The Open Society and Its Enemies, the paradox addresses a fundamental dilemma. If a society is tolerant without limit, its ability to be tolerant may ultimately be destroyed by the intolerant. This idea challenges the notion that tolerance must always be extended to all viewpoints and behaviors, even those that seek to undermine the very principle of tolerance itself. At the heart of the paradox is a tension between two liberal ideals: freedom of expression and the preservation of an open, inclusive society. On the surface, absolute tolerance seems virtuous and morally consistent. It treats all opinions and ideologies with respect, even those that are hostile to pluralism. But Popper warned that allowing intolerant ideologies to spread unchecked could enable them to erode the freedoms of others. If given enough power, intolerant groups can dismantle democratic institutions, silence dissent, and oppress minorities. In this way, unlimited tolerance can lead to the end of tolerance itself. This is not merely a theoretical issue. History offers numerous examples of movements that exploited liberal tolerance in order to grow and eventually crush it. Fascist and totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, for instance, often rose to power through democratic means, only to abolish democratic rights once they gained control. Popper's warning was grounded in this historical reality. Tolerating the intolerant is not a sign of moral strength, but potentially a path to collective self-destruction. Crucially, the paradox does not suggest that we must suppress all views we disagree with. Popper made an important distinction: we should tolerate most views, even those we find deeply wrong or offensive, as long as they do not actively advocate violence, coercion, or the destruction of democratic norms. The paradox arises only when tolerance is extended to ideologies that reject tolerance as a principle, those that use the freedoms of an open society to promote hatred, exclusion, or authoritarianism. In response to this, Popper argued that we must be prepared to defend a tolerant society by being intolerant of intolerance. This does not mean preemptive censorship or authoritarian suppression, but rather a readiness to confront, criticize, and, if necessary, prohibit groups or ideologies that threaten the foundations of peaceful coexistence. This might include hate speech laws, limits on extremist propaganda, or legal restrictions on organizations that incite violence or discrimination. The paradox of tolerance raises important ethical and legal questions. How do we distinguish between mere disagreement and genuine threats to tolerance? Who decides what counts as intolerant speech or action? How do we avoid becoming intolerant ourselves in the name of defending tolerance? These are difficult questions with no simple answers. But Popper's insight remains essential. A society that values freedom and diversity must be willing to defend those values, sometimes even against those who would use them as a weapon. Ultimately, the paradox of tolerance reminds us that tolerance is not a passive virtue. It requires vigilance, courage, and discernment. True tolerance does not mean accepting everything indiscriminately, but rather standing firm against what would destroy the conditions under which tolerance can flourish. A tolerant society, in order to remain tolerant, must sometimes refuse to tolerate the intolerant. The principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is a foundational concept in metaphysics and philosophy that asserts that everything must have a reason or cause. Put simply, it holds that for anything that exists, occurs, or is true, there must be a sufficient explanation for why it is so and not otherwise. This principle has been a cornerstone of rational inquiry for centuries, shaping the way philosophers think about causality, existence, and explanation. It demands that nothing happens without a reason, that no fact stands brute and unexplained, and that every truth has some basis or grounding. The roots of the principle of sufficient reason can be traced back to ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in the works of Parmenides and Plato, but it was most rigorously formulated by the 17th-century rationalist philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. For Leibniz, the principle was not only a tool for logical clarity but a deep metaphysical truth. He argued that the world must be intelligible to reason, and that every fact, no matter how small or large, must have a rationale. Even God's choices, in Leibniz's view, must follow this principle. God created the best of all possible worlds, not arbitrarily, but for sufficient reasons known to divine wisdom. The principle of sufficient reason applies across different domains of philosophy. In metaphysics, it underpins the search for explanations of existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does this particular thing exist instead of something else? In epistemology, it motivates the pursuit of coherent systems of belief, where each belief is supported by reasons and not simply accepted without justification. In science, it inspires the search for causes behind phenomena, insisting that even seemingly random events must have underlying explanations, if not immediately observable, then at least in principle. This principle also plays a crucial role in cosmological arguments for the existence of God. For instance, in the argument from contingency, philosophers like Leibniz and later Richard Swinburne claim that contingent beings, those that could have failed to exist, require an explanation for why they exist. Since the universe appears to be contingent, it too requires an explanation, one that can only be provided by a necessary being, which exists by its very nature and not by something else. Whether one accepts this conclusion or not, the reasoning rests squarely on the principle of sufficient reason. However, the principle is not without controversy. Critics, particularly in the empiricist tradition, have questioned whether it is universally valid. David Hume, for example, challenged the assumption that everything must have a cause, arguing that our belief in causation stems more from habit than from logical necessity. In modern physics, quantum mechanics has further complicated the picture. Certain interpretations of quantum events suggest that particles may behave probabilistically, without deterministic causes. This has led some to claim that the principle of sufficient reason might not hold at the most fundamental levels of reality. Despite these challenges, many philosophers continue to regard the principle as indispensable for rational thought. Even if it cannot be conclusively proven, it functions as a kind of methodological postulate, the assumption that the world is intelligible, that mysteries are temporary, and that unexplained facts are simply not yet understood. Without such a principle, the entire project of philosophy and science, based on inquiry, explanation, and coherence, would lose much of its grounding. In essence, the principle of sufficient reason reflects a deep human conviction, that the world is not arbitrary, that reasons can be found, and that understanding is possible. It is a philosophical commitment to the idea that reality makes sense, and that through reason, we can uncover the logic that underlies it. Whether as a metaphysical law or a guiding ideal, it remains a powerful force in shaping our pursuit of knowledge and meaning. The Veil of Ignorance. The Veil of Ignorance is a powerful and influential thought experiment in political and moral philosophy, most famously developed by the 20th-century philosopher John Rawls in his landmark work A Theory of Justice. It is designed as a tool for determining the principles of a just society by encouraging fairness through impartial reasoning. The idea is to imagine that, when deciding the rules and structure of society, individuals are placed behind a metaphorical veil of ignorance that prevents them from knowing their own place in that society. They do not know their gender, race, social class, intelligence, health, talents, religion, or values. In this condition of ignorance, Rawls argues, people are far more likely to choose fair and just principles, because they have no knowledge of how those principles might benefit or disadvantage them personally. The fundamental aim of the veil of ignorance is to eliminate bias and self-interest from moral and political deliberation. If you don't know whether you will be born rich or poor, healthy or ill, privileged or marginalized, you are incentivized to choose rules that protect everyone equally, especially the worst off, because you might end up being one of them. For Rawls, this imaginative exercise leads rational agents to endorse two key principles of justice. The first guarantees equal basic liberties for all citizens, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the rule of law. The second allows social and economic inequalities only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society, a condition known as the difference principle. The veil of ignorance is grounded in the social contract tradition, which posits that political legitimacy arises from a hypothetical agreement among free and equal individuals. But Rawls departs from earlier thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau by refining the process of that agreement. Rather than imagining people forming a society out of self-interest or survival, Rawls asks what principles rational beings would agree upon if they had no knowledge of their personal circumstances, ensuring that the agreement is fair from the start. One of the strengths of the veil of ignorance is that it does not rely on a specific moral theory like utilitarianism, which seeks the greatest good for the greatest number. In fact, Rawls explicitly criticizes utilitarianism for potentially sacrificing the rights or well-being of individuals for the sake of overall benefit. Behind the veil, no one would accept such a risk, since they might end up being the person sacrificed. Instead, Rawls's approach ensures that justice respects each person's moral worth, regardless of their social position. The idea has been influential not just in philosophy but also in law, economics, and public policy. It offers a framework for evaluating fairness in taxation, healthcare, education, and political rights. For example, one might ask whether a particular policy, say, access to public healthcare, would be chosen if people didn't know whether they would be born wealthy or poor, healthy or chronically ill. If the answer is yes, the policy can be seen as just under Rawls's criteria. Despite its wide appeal, the veil of ignorance has faced criticism. Some argue that it is too abstract or idealized, ignoring the complexities of real-world politics, where interests and power dynamics cannot simply be set aside. Others contend that people behind the veil might not all agree on the same principles, or that their choices would reflect cultural and psychological assumptions that are themselves biased. Libertarians, for instance, may reject the idea that redistributive justice is necessary or fair, even under conditions of impartiality. Nonetheless, the veil of ignorance remains a compelling moral device because it challenges individuals to think beyond their own interests and to consider society from a universal point of view. It reframes justice as fairness, not as favoritism, and encourages empathy by asking us to imagine ourselves in every possible position in society. In this way, it continues to serve as a guiding principle for those who seek to build institutions and policies that respect human dignity and equality. Wu Wei. Wu Wei is a foundational concept in Taoist philosophy, often translated as non-action, effortless action, or action without force. Though the term might initially seem to suggest passivity or inactivity, its true meaning is more subtle and profound. Wu Wei refers to a way of being and acting in the world that aligns with the natural flow of life and the Tao, or Tao, which is the fundamental principle underlying all things in Taoist thought. It is not about doing nothing, but about not forcing, not striving against the grain, and not interfering unnecessarily with the spontaneous order of nature. In the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, Wu Wei is presented as a mode of conduct that allows one to be in harmony with the Tao. The idea is that the universe operates through a natural and spontaneous order that does not require excessive control or manipulation. Human beings, however, often act out of ego, ambition, or desire, imposing their will in ways that disrupt this order. Wu Wei encourages the opposite, a quiet receptivity, a letting go of rigid plans and attachments, and an embrace of simplicity, spontaneity, and trust in the way things unfold. For a Taoist sage or ruler, Wu Wei implies a kind of wise governance, not through force or micromanagement, but through gentle guidance and minimal intervention. The most effective leaders, according to Taoism, are those who govern so effortlessly and in such harmony with the natural tendencies of the people that it seems as if nothing is being done at all. This approach values flexibility, humility, and restraint, recognizing that excessive interference often causes more harm than good. In daily life, Wu Wei is about approaching tasks and relationships in a manner that is fluid rather than rigid, adaptive rather than controlling. A person practicing Wu Wei might respond to challenges not by pushing harder, but by stepping back, observing, and allowing the appropriate response to arise naturally. It is akin to the way water flows around obstacles, soft and yielding, yet capable of shaping stone over time. Water is often used in Taoist texts as a metaphor for Wu Wei. It moves with ease, seeks the lowest place, and nourishes all things without contention. Importantly, Wu Wei is not laziness or indifference. It requires attentiveness and sensitivity to the rhythms of life. It also involves a kind of inner discipline, letting go of the ego's need to control outcomes and allowing oneself to be guided by intuition, experience, and the present moment. In this sense, it bears similarities to concepts in other traditions, such as the Buddhist idea of non-attachment, the Christian notion of divine surrender, or even the psychological state of flow in modern positive psychology, where one becomes fully immersed in an activity with a sense of effortless engagement. The practice of Wu Wei challenges dominant cultural values that emphasize constant striving, productivity, and control. It suggests that true effectiveness and wisdom often come from stepping aside, from not overthinking or overreaching, and from trusting the deep patterns of life. It is a call to live in tune with the world rather than against it. Ultimately, Wu Wei is a way of harmonizing one's life with the greater unfolding of the cosmos. It invites a kind of gracefulness, a capacity to move through the world with quiet strength and deep understanding, recognizing that the most meaningful actions often arise not from forceful effort, but from being fully present and letting things take their natural course. Radical skepticism. Radical skepticism is a deeply unsettling and intellectually provocative philosophical position that challenges the very possibility of certain or reliable knowledge. Unlike ordinary skepticism, which may doubt specific claims or areas of inquiry, such as political spin or pseudoscience, radical skepticism asks a far more fundamental question: can we truly know anything at all? It casts doubt not just on particular beliefs, but on the entire structure of human knowledge, including our beliefs about the external world, other minds, and even the reliability of our own senses and reasoning. The roots of radical skepticism run deep in the history of philosophy. Ancient Greek thinkers like Pyrrho of Elis and later the academic skeptics questioned whether humans could ever attain objective knowledge, arguing that for any claim, an equally plausible counterclaim could be made. But perhaps the most iconic formulation of radical skepticism emerged in the 17th century with René Descartes, who famously set out to discard all beliefs that could possibly be doubted in order to find a foundation of certainty. Descartes' methodical doubt led him to question the evidence of the senses. What if everything he perceived was a dream? What if a powerful deceiver, a malicious demon, was manipulating his thoughts, leading him to believe in a reality that didn't exist? In the face of these radical doubts, Descartes found only one belief he could not coherently doubt: cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Even if he were being deceived, the very act of doubting proved that something, namely his own consciousness, existed. Modern forms of radical skepticism expand on these questions. The brain in a vat thought experiment, for instance, asks, How do you know you're not just a disembodied brain wired to a supercomputer, fed illusions of a world that doesn't actually exist? Similar concerns arise from contemporary discussions about simulated realities, popularized in fiction such as The Matrix. If such scenarios are conceivable, and we cannot rule them out conclusively, how can we claim to know that our experience corresponds to reality? Radical skepticism also extends to the problem of induction, highlighted by David Hume. Hume questioned how we can justify our belief that the future will resemble the past, that the sun will rise tomorrow just because it always has. Since this belief relies on inductive reasoning, generalizing from past experience, and there is no non-circular way to justify induction itself, our confidence in cause and effect relationships rests on habit, not rational certainty. These skeptical challenges are not merely academic exercises. They strike at the heart of epistemology, the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. If radical skepticism is right, then all claims to truth, scientific understanding, or even everyday beliefs might rest on shaky, unjustified grounds. This possibility disturbs our confidence in rational inquiry and raises difficult questions about the limits of human understanding. However, few philosophers fully embrace radical skepticism. Most see it as a challenge to be answered rather than a conclusion to be accepted. Several responses have emerged. Foundationalism, as in Descartes' case, seeks indubitable beliefs upon which other knowledge can be built. Coherentism argues that beliefs are justified not by foundational certainty, but by how well they fit within a network of mutually supporting beliefs. Reliabilism holds that beliefs can be justified if they are produced by reliable cognitive processes, even if we can't fully explain why those processes work. Contextualism suggests that knowledge claims are sensitive to context. While we might not know something under hyperskeptical scrutiny, we can still meaningfully claim to know it in everyday life. Some philosophers, such as Ludwig Wittgenstein and G. E. Moore, respond to radical skepticism by rejecting its premises altogether. Moore famously raised his hand and said, "Here is a hand," arguing that such basic perceptions are more certain than any skeptical argument that would call them into doubt. Wittgenstein suggested that doubting everything is incoherent, because doubt itself presupposes a framework of trust and shared meaning. In conclusion, radical skepticism is a powerful philosophical force that compels us to examine the assumptions underpinning our knowledge and perception of reality. While few live as though radical skepticism were true, after all, we rely on sensory experience and memory every day, it remains a persistent philosophical shadow. Its value lies not in paralyzing doubt, but in sharpening our awareness of what it means to know, to believe, and to trust in reason. Whether we ultimately refute it, work around it, or learn to live with it, radical skepticism serves as a relentless test of the depth and resilience of human understanding.